First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the time you are giving us. And Thomas Mayne has been many times called the bad boy of Los Angeles architecture.
Oh no,
Yeah.
Here we go.
As well as a product of the turbulent 60s. Very often you personally talk about yourself as an outsider. Morphosis, to be in formation, the name you choose for your firm in 1972 still suggests and reminds your fervent desire for the change. And one single definition for Thomas Mayne's architectural style has been very difficult to find. You are the winner of the 2005 Pritzker Prize and the first American to win the prize after 14 years. So now I would like you to give us your personal definition of the architect, Tom Mayne.
Boy, you asked me about an hour's worth of questions. There are about 5 questions in there at least. Anyway, we were discussing over lunch some similar topics. The bad boy seems to come up all the time. And I think you'll find that architecture, any art form, takes some sort of a distance from normative life, how things behave in a normal way. And you have to find a position. And it's somehow, it has to be, it has to locate a problem. And it has to take a position to the problem, and it has to be critical. Literally, you call it architecture. Critical architecture represents a certain type of architect that's thinking and trying to resolve certain types of problems. You differentiate that from a normative architect, or an architect that's dealing in the world of business, say, right? And I think my trajectory, like many architects that are interested in an architecture that's exploring, that's in some way critical of the normative, of how it exists today, has to find a distance. And that distance is that isolation, that separateness from the world is required for any artistic act, I would say. If you're a writer, if you're a poet, if you're making a film, it's literally establishing who you are, establishing an identity, and an identity that you can locate, you can articulate. And the first job for a young person out of school, coming out of school, is to start formulating my own history, to start understanding how I locate architecture in the system of values of how the world operates. And some people will find that irritating. And my sense is that the notion of bad boy in some way was, what is it? It's isolating me, it's marginalizing me, kind of putting me over here. And I didn't want to be put over here, I want to be put right here, right in the middle. Although I have to say, when that first came out, it somewhat irritated me. And my students and a lot of my colleagues laughed and thought it was really funny. They said, hey, this is a great thing. What are you talking about? I just turned 62. And they said, anybody that still calls you a bad boy, you must be doing something right. They still use the word boy. Because it also represents a precociousness or the kind of, architecture takes a continual inquiry, a curiosity is at the basis of any kind of thinking. Clever in negotiating or finding a middle ground, which you clearly get as you mature. And you grow kind of into this situation. So that now, one of the people, somebody wrote regarding the Pritzker, they were reading everywhere, bad boy. Again, I was looking, I'm working in Madrid right now. All 3 newspapers had Chico Malo, Thomas Mayne.
Again.
And then they're announcing me. And this one person looked at it and said, something's wrong. Well, you're a part journalist or whatever, right? And sometimes you kind of repeat things. Anyway, this person looked at it and said, well, something's odd here, because this person's building all large-scale institutional and government buildings. It couldn't be too bad, because that requires huge, huge negotiating skills. And actually questioned it and called me. And so I would say it's also kind of an old, that's part of my past, and that's part of something that's I certainly honor and that you have to do if it means you're part of a resistance And because again, I see resistance as completely, totally an important aspect of a serious architecture. It has to come from a beginning resistance, right? Otherwise, why bother? If you don't have any vision of the world, if you have no idea of how you're going to change things, wrong profession. Right? I'd say the same thing for a politician. There'd be no reason to do that. If you have no idea of how you want to move the world, if you have no concept of somehow changing it within a social, political, wherever you want to approach, right? But anyway, so I'd say recently, no. I'm no longer, in fact, I'm kind of a good boy.
I know it will be difficult to give me a brief answer to my question, but can you describe your working method while you are facing a new project? I mean, according to your conception of dynamism and fluidity and energy in your architecture, is it possible to find a methodology, a precise, creative and evolutionary process that leads you from the very beginning of the project to the final result?
The method is also evolving. So there's an architecture which comes from a process or a method, and the architecture is changing, and the process and method that's making the architecture is evolving. So there'd be two discussions. If you're going to ask me what is morphosis, or what is the representative nature of morphosis, the work, I would say it's embedded in process and not the product. And morphosis is a way of engendering a notion of a collective creative process. And then it starts with a series of questions that are just about parallel to a psychoanalytic process, where you put in front of me a project and we start investigating or interrogating that project with a series of questions. And those questions lead to the first hunches, the first instinctual kind of directions. And then I work through reiteration. You make something, you attack it, you remake it. And it goes through over and over until you somehow exhausted the problem, until you feel that your energy is no longer well spent and it's complete. And I think I've been told by people, I'm too close to it maybe, that somehow when something comes out of our office, our studio, that it's understood that we have a reputation for putting out a product that has a certain kind of energy, and it's articulated a certain way that in itself represents the studio, which represents an output of this continual reiterative. That make sense? Where you just keep working on it until it's, right? Not a single idea out working on it, but it's continually, and it's also a kind of aggressive process, because you really attack it. You try to debunk it. You try to turn it over. You try to disprove it, and through that you keep finding new kind of directions as it finds its way. And I'm interested in what I can't perceive. I want to produce something that I can't preconceive, okay. And that's what excites me. When I actually see something that's gone somewhere that I couldn't have imagined, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
It must be difficult for the client to follow you in this work.
Well,
no?
It is and it isn't. It's absolutely, you have to have, I guess, the right clients that are open and are open to that kind of investigation, which could be, some people can be quite insecure with that, I guess. They just want solutions, it's this, it's that, right? But on the other hand, I think I've had kind of really lovely experiences where you're an educator and you're developing with the client. You're starting to you have to bring them along to understand the nature of this process. And I think once they realize that it has a trajectory, it has a focus, and that it is, moving forward. It's kind of a complicated philosophical question, but it is moving towards resolution, that as they see it, and that it's extremely flexible. You can shift it, and all of a sudden it can move over here, and you can shift it again. and that they are empowered in that process because they're part of the discussion. It turns quite around. It becomes very mesmerizing, actually. Because I've had clients where I had to go, "Enough, stop," because all of a sudden they're getting extremely interested in the process and they don't even want it to finish, which makes total sense. It's having a baby or something. It's giving birth to something. It's phenomenal, actually. It's incredibly wonderful to watch this little child grow in this way and that way. And like a human experience, you can push it this way and push it that way and ask questions, but it doesn't always behave. It goes over here and you've got to kind of move, and then it goes over here again and you're running over this way. And it has to do with the ultimate power of architecture and the power of an idea as it has its own strength, which has been a literary idea that's been around for quite a while, where one accepts the idea is beyond the author. It's been as an idea has been around for a couple decades, I think. Right?
I will ask you something about it later.
Like a Tom Robbins that lets you know one of his characters is, I don't know if you've
Yes.
ever read Tom Robbins, another roadside attraction, but he's a character, John Fowle is the same, where all of a sudden you'll be reading, and all of a sudden he'll say, he'll let you know he's writing the story, and I'm typing as fast as I can, and the character's moving away, and all of a sudden the character kind of went over here, and I'm trying to move it back the other
Follow
way.
them.
And what he's doing is he's allowing you to understand that what you're reading is a fiction, but has its own life, and it's an incredibly interesting kind of idea, and it separates it from him and his authority. And I guess that's what I'm interested in, a very opposite idea of the authority of the architect, that in some way you're taking your authority away, and you're able to manipulate something, but you're not controlling it. Make sense? You're more of an auteur, you're directing, but like not Fellini maybe, more like a Robert Altman. You like the happenstance to take power, the contingent, which for me would be more the word in architecture. I like the entering of reality, and I like the entering of contingency in the work.
Especially considering the Hypo Albe Adria Center, and such as the Caltran District 7, but also considering the approach you have towards the architecture as ground manipulation. I would like to know which role you give to the materials in your architectural conception, and in which phase of your work in this procedure do you make the choice of the materials?
Start with a broader conceptual idea, and the tectonic, the structure, is at the service of the idea, not about structure. Might be, but it's about the idea itself, and then how the tectonics of the building services the idea, and then with that, the material, which is connected to a general approach towards tectonic, the general notion of treating a building structurally, etc., develops again at the service of the work, but somewhat in a generic way. Like there's things I don't deal with. Not comfortable with color, not comfortable with materials that are kind of over-articulated. You'll probably see that most of the work uses very generic. Yes. I use concrete, I use steel, glass, metal of different types. Not trying to be over-specific and not about an architecture of materials, much more about materials that are, again, servicing the idea, and they're much more about space and about organization. And allowing the human figure to complete the work. We've had a lot of discussion, and maybe it's probably more of a discussion in the US than it is in Europe. The US seems to like a certain kind of clutter, and they want to fill everything. They can't have empty space. Like to be a piazza in the States is impossible just to make an empty space. They don't understand it. You have to fill it with stuff. And they also, they're looking more toward, I think, kind of a decorative approach in terms of architecture. And when you strip it, it's difficult for them. And I always show them work that's empty and then filled with people. And the color and that level of specificity and the human figure is defining scale, to me, is the completion. And I like the work as a more empty kind of palette, material-wise, and a certain amount of emptiness in the work, unless it's part of an articulation that has to do with certain complexities I'm interested in that comes out of the direct nature of the work itself.
And what about natural materials, like stone?
Today it has to be free of time to some degree. And I think I was getting clear about my approach to history, that I'm not comfortable with anything that touches the nostalgic or the literal, and I'm interested in the aspects of history that you bring forward, the notion of tradition or the notion of conservation, but the thing you conserve is something much more deeper, much more first principle, much more inherent in the structural aspect of something, not in the literal. It's not the facade or the material or the literalness of it, because that's it turns immediately into kitsch, which is all of US, of course, that touches that. Well, you here too, of course. But you bring forward principles, right? That, but not the literal. And I think very early on, I started becoming more aware of that, and immediately left the more specific material, hence the discussion with stone.
Okay. What does a well-done project means for you?
God, there's no such thing as a well-done project. I've never done a well-done project. It's really, my wife thinks I'm Calvinistic because I can't appreciate my own work, but I think you get so close to it, and your own visions are always beyond your capability of reality, that it's just about painful. I'm serious. Really? There's times I don't even want to see it. I'd rather... There's playwright, Lillian Hellman, I heard, was like that. When their play opened, she couldn't even be in the audience. She was pacing back and forth in the lobby, smoking 20 million cigarettes, and then would hear the people came out and would want to know immediately whether it was successful or not in whatever term she was looking at. And I'm closer to that. It's funny, I don't care what people think about it. Actually, they can hate it or love it. It's only the in-between that would destroy me, and that doesn't seem to be my problem. And that I see architecture is something that's supposed to develop inquiry, and if you like it, we live in architecture is a cultural phenomenon, and we live in a polycultural world, in a heterogeneous world, so it's not possible to please everybody. Who's perspective? Somebody from Beijing, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Kenya, where do you want to go? And it's just the notion of trying to please somebody visually, I think, is a complete misunderstanding of a task of an architect. I'm interested in somehow bringing forward something that preoccupies you, that's interesting somehow, that takes you someplace. But that being said, when I go to the site, I just see problems. Just everything that wasn't done correctly. Not discounting that I can, in a deeper way, feel very comfortable that I've achieved something. I'm not saying that. That I can, certainly when I finished IPOBank, I was extremely gratified in a little town, very conservative part of the country, and I realized I achieved the project. I was extremely proud of it. But the next level of actually walking there, more difficult. I can't imagine, because it's also, it probably is the basis of what drives me. You know, that you're constantly working against that force to produce something that's closer to your vision. And at some point, I think I realize that now, that I'm old enough to understand that I'll never reach that point. It's not possible. It's a moving target, right? And that it's a psychological state that actually pushes you to get to the next place.
Thank you very much to Thomas Mayne. Thank you for being here together.
My pleasure.